This image is Mother Archie's Church, which is a location here in Chadds Ford that Jim Welling sought out in Wyeth's time painting around Chadds Ford. This was a structure yet, and he went inside of it. He painted from many angles, inside and outside, and that was in the 1950s. But by the time Welling gets here between 2005, or rather 2010 and the present, it's really gone into destruction, and so it seems as if a lot of time has passed between these two. The generation is really evident, the generation of difference is really evident in this work that Welling and Wyeth walked the same landscape in a very different time period. Yeah, so this is a photograph that is called Winter Corn, and it's based on a specific Andrew Wyeth painting, but also a very general sense of Wyeth's love for dried grasses and dried leaves and kind of decaying natural bits of nature that you could find around his studio. This is a really large image, you're probably noticing, and they're all inkjet prints. So you can imagine the size of the printer that this would have to come out of. Inkjet prints are a very kind of simplistic and yet really sophisticated way to get a good color image reproduced. And the inkjet, the ink lays on the surface of the paper and kind of builds a little bit of texture on it, just the way a painter would build up on, say, watercolor paper. This image was also the lead image used when a few of the Wyeth works were exhibited in London. So these works have been seen in small groups in Japan, in London, and around the United States, but this is the real capstone of the whole project, bringing so many of them together at once. This photograph is called Stream, and it was done in 2011, and one of the real important coloristic features of this exhibition is capturing those really intense greens of summertime around Chadds Ford. As an artist from Los Angeles, that's one of the things that James Welling was really struck and impressed by, the reality of the colors here. And it's also reflective of a lot of late Andrew Wyeth watercolors where the greens had become very, very intense. And so this is a bit of a botanical study, just a very close-up view of some greenery around Chadds Ford. And we're going to be putting together an Andrew Wyeth exhibition very soon that will focus on Andrew Wyeth botanicals. So in the next few months, you'll be able to see the original watercolors and then come upstairs here and see the photograph as well. All right, well, this is one of the larger photographs, and it's titled Renfield. And Renfield is the name of an Andrew Wyeth painting. So here's another instance where we have more of a compositional relationship, where James Welling was going and looking for that place that Andrew Wyeth painted. And in this case, that place is a local house here in Chadds Ford that's known as Painter's Folly. Painter's Folly was owned by the artist Howard Pyle, and he held school and classes for young artists there. It's now owned by a local couple who were great friends of Andrew Wyeth, and Wyeth often painted in that house. He painted their portraits, he painted all sorts of imagery in that house and was great friends with them. So for two reasons then, this location was important to James Welling. And he visited there on a very cold January morning where the whole cupola was frosted over, and then he came back on another day and shot it in broad daylight, as you see here, although it doesn't look like broad daylight. He used a technique called day for night. With this day for night technique, it really helps to bring out all the details, especially in this really complicated architecture of the cupola. So the light coming in through the windows in the daylight helps to form these bright spots and dark shadows that are really angular and geometric in a way that you wouldn't have gotten if you were actually shooting in the twilight. But then Welling takes the scene, the sky, and he blues it out. He changes, he alters the color so that it looks like nighttime. And there's a few images in this exhibition where he shoots day for night, and night for night, and day for day.
The stars in the background, is that?
That would be photoshopped in Photoshop stars. So you can see little flecks of light here that represent the night sky, and that actually relates back to the Wyeth painting again, which was a nighttime scene. And you can see in the Wyeth painting the road, Route 1, coming through Chadds Ford and the little headlights coming down the road. Well, here we don't have headlights because in actuality Route 1 isn't visible in that way. But now he's added the little twilight, sparkly stars up in the sky here. Okay, well, we're standing here with Feather, which is a brand new print by James Welling. As a matter of fact, it arrived separately from the rest of the exhibition, coming direct from the studio when we framed it here. This composition was the result of both thinking about specific and, again, general Andrew Wyeth paintings and his love for birds. And sometimes they were dead birds, sometimes they were just feathers, sometimes actual live birds. Last fall, James Welling was invited to give a talk at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. during a Andrew Wyeth Scholars Day. And one of the points he focused on was the use of birds and feathers in Wyeth's paintings. There's one called Eagle Eye and another called Airborne, where feathers or birds play a large role. And so, kind of as a tribute to that, Welling makes this image of a feather standing inside a barn. And it's not a specific Andrew Wyeth painting, but it's an homage to Andrew Wyeth, as so many of these works are.
And Wyeth actually put feathers on the paper in some of the work, I believe.
That, you know, it wouldn't surprise me because you find in his tray of tools at the Andrew Wyeth studio pens, pencils, paintbrushes, and feathers. All right, well, this photograph is really a tribute to a well-known Andrew Wyeth painting called Groundhog Day that's in the collection of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Groundhog Day is a painting that Wyeth made at the Kerner Farm. And the Kerner Farm is a historic property that you can visit through the Brandywine River Museum of Art. When you go to Kerner Farm, you'll see the space where Andrew Wyeth worked and so often painted. One of the key features of the painting Groundhog Day is a place setting at the Kerner's dinner table. And you'll see a very plain plate, a very plain cup and saucer, just like you see here. And when he first visited the Kerner Farm and found this vignette laid out, James Welling was really excited to see it and wanted to photograph it right away. So excited, in fact, that he tells the story of how he didn't set his camera up properly, and it was such low resolution, and he was so disappointed to come back to his studio and find that he hadn't gotten the great photo he wanted. But with the magic of Photoshop, he worked with it and worked it into a usable image. If you look really closely, you can see some of the pixelation, but he wanted to capture his own excitement of the first meeting with the Kerner Farm scene and use that as a jumping off point for making an image that included his own reaction to an Andrew Wyeth painting. The photograph here is called Anna's Kitchen, and it really matches up with the other photograph called Groundhog Day really well. It shows you this bright yellow paint and wallpaper that you would have found in the Kerner's family kitchen, a farm kitchen really. And there are traces of that wallpaper, and it's very iconic, and you see it in a number of Andrew Wyeth paintings as well. So there's a couple of photographs that Welling has made that really document the house and the places of Andrew Wyeth's world, even if it's not a specific scene from an Andrew Wyeth painting. This scene was also used, or rather this photograph was also used to play into a new project that Wyeth had, or rather that Welling had done, called the Gradients Project. And when you visit now, at least through the run of the exhibition, and see this scene, you're going to see a small sculpture that's been placed here in Anna's kitchen that goes along with a color experiment that Welling has been doing and making sculptures out of. The Kerner Farm is open to the public, and you can go on tours several times a day, every day here from the Brandywine River Museum. You'd be able to see inside the house, the Kerner kitchen, just as you see it here with Anna's yellow wallpaper. You'll be able to go inside their barn and see some of the barn implements and the spring house, or rather the the scene from Spring Fed that Andrew Wyeth painted, the water is still running right over the edge of the stone sink, just like it was in his time. And it's really a step back into an Andrew Wyeth painting. And I think some of these images capture James Welling's excitement about finding a place here in Chadds Ford where he can step into an Andrew Wyeth painting.
And Andrew Wyeth stepped into Carl Kerner's world. Carl was a surrogate father.
That's true. I mean, the reason the Kerners were so important to Andrew Wyeth was that he met them and became very close to them just after his father, N.C. Wyeth's death. And Carl Kerner became that surrogate father to him, and he and Anna were German immigrants, and they struggled with finding their place in 20th century America, even in Pennsylvania and on their farm. They had difficulties adjusting, but Andrew Wyeth was like a son to them. And many of the images take scenes from the Kerner farm and turn them into near portraits of the Kerners. Even when they're not in the image, they become present in their absence. Well, this composition is called hooks, and it's actually 6 different images that have been laid in together in a grid-like format. The hooks represent these iron features, kind of scary looking features, that are on the 3rd floor of the Kerner farm here in Chadds Ford. Now, the 3rd floor isn't part of the normal tour, so this is really special, getting to see some of the architectural features that aren't usually open to the public. These hooks featured into a number of Andrew Wyeth paintings, I think most notably his portrait of Carl Kerner, which was a very dominant image of Carl Kerner taken from below, and then you can see the hooks that are actually located in the ceiling of this very low room on the 3rd floor. These hooks are something that you find in a lot of Pennsylvania German architecture. They were used for various things. When the Kerners lived there, they most frequently used these hooks to hang meat to dry, or to string lines between to dry herbs or plants, or even laundry. So despite how sinister they can look, they were very functional in their time, and James Welling notes not how sinister they are, but actually he says it reminds him of the runners of old-fashioned sleds. So it's more of a nostalgic wintertime scene, even though it's the ceiling of an old house when Jim gets his hands on it. This photograph is called Evening at Kerner's, and that title matches an Andrew Wyeth painting. And it's a classic view of the Kerner farm landscape. We have the Kerner's farmhouse here, surrounded by pine trees and just a little bit of the twilight in the sky overhead. One of the things, when we talk about the way that James Welling photoshopped or altered the images, edited them in some ways, one of the things he wanted to bring to life here was that there was life in the Kerner farm, and he did that by adding light into the window of just one of the Kerner farmhouse windows. So he gives that sense, as Wyeth and even his father N.C. Wyeth did in a number of pictures of architecture. Putting that one light on gives you the sense of the people that belong in that house too. This photograph represents, not in a completely direct way, but referentially, a painting that Andrew Wyeth did called Young Bull. Now in the Andrew Wyeth painting you actually have the livestock present, but here James Welling takes that location, which is on the Kerner farm right at the barnyard, and makes it the site of his new photograph. He's also done some changes in the landscape as well. That Kerner Hill would be right about here if you were looking at the scene, but in fact he's moved it over and stretched it out a little bit and put it here. And similarly, some of the trees are a little bit different than you're going to see them in nature right now if you visit the Kerner farm. But this green bucket really anchors the scene, and as a matter of fact, it's there by chance because the Kerner farm is still a working farm and there's livestock in that fenced-in area. We were looking for it just the other day, and it hasn't traveled too far since James Welling took this photograph. It's right inside the barnyard now with a couple of our new goats. The photograph here that is called Dry Pigments represents a very close-up scene of a detail of the studio of Andrew Wyeth. Now, if you visit the studio, you can come visit the museum here and get a tour of this studio, but you're going to see a long row of jars of dried pigments along the windowsill in the Andrew Wyeth studio. Those pigments are used to make egg tempera paint, and that's Andrew Wyeth's preferred medium, really. He was a great watercolor artist, but he was also an egg tempera painter. And to make egg tempera, you take dry pigments like this, and you can see them separated by their color. Some even have their original labels on them. And you would mix each paint with eggs as you go, so that it is ready-made paint just when you need it, not pre-bought. So one of the things that fascinated Jim Welling about visiting the Andrew Wyeth studio was seeing these brilliant colors in the pigments. Now, further down the shelf, you see bright oranges and colors that don't necessarily ring true to you of being Wyeth colors. But remember, towards the end of his life, he was getting more into these intense greens, teals, turquoises, and of course, Wyeth would work them until they were more and more and more subtle. So you don't necessarily look and say, oh, that's a very Wyeth palette, but that's in fact where Andrew Wyeth started from. And it's one of those important learning points when you visit an artist's studio, that it shows you the fact from the fiction about how these works of art were made.
Very good. And that's a pencil sharpener in the foreground?
It sure is. I mean, I know kids today don't recognize it, but it is.
Yeah. Wow. And Wyeth learned egg tempera from his brother-in-law.
Mm-hmm. And I always think it's interesting because his father did not do egg tempera. You know, they had opposite mediums in many respects. And there's a little bit of not doing what your father did before you, even though you're still doing what your father did before you in some way. So as James Welling looked around the studios, he sometimes caught the things that we don't necessarily look at and say are very pretty or picturesque. The cracks in the walls and in the ceilings, in fact, turn out to be those same colors that you saw in the pigments lined up on the windowsill. And this turns into an abstract composition that was there looking right in Andrew Wyeth's face the whole time he was painting. And Welling turns sometimes the other cheek, I guess you could say, and looks in the direction that the artist didn't necessarily look in to absorb the entire environment. The studio mirror is something that you would see in a lot of artist studios, I mean, all throughout the centuries, because a mirror helps an artist to see the painting he's working on from a different perspective. It wasn't about doing self-portraits all the time. It was a little bit more about seeing his own work from a distance. And that mirror is still within the studio, and we keep it as part of the explanation of how an artist works. Even Andrew Wyeth, who wasn't doing a lot of self-portraits, would have needed a mirror, and his son Jamie Wyeth also had a mirror set up in his part of the studio to sort of check his work as he went. And so as James Welling walks into the space, this is one of the main features of the central studio, and it kind of commands attention whether you're a visitor today or whether you are another artist looking at that space. Part of the tour of the Andrew Wyeth studio takes you into and lets you have a peek at the library that Andrew Wyeth kept. And this was one of the things that fascinated Welling, is to see the kind of books that Andrew Wyeth was reading. And this shelf is filled with Albert Dürer books. Books about the German early Renaissance artist who's really well known for his engravings and his fine detail, and is an artist that Andrew Wyeth really admired. And you could kind of count like maybe half a dozen Dürer books here, but right on the end here is one of Thomas Eakins. So he has a lot of mixed influences and unexpected juxtapositions that go into the influence of an Andrew Wyeth painting. And I think that James Welling was really learning something about the artist and his process as he looked at the bookshelves, and there are many bookshelves there to look at.
Yeah.
So this photograph is titled Storm at Sea, and it follows in the naming pattern of taking an Andrew Wyeth painting and making a photograph that's vaguely reminiscent of that painting. And here what Welling finds is up in Maine, a lighthouse that Andrew Wyeth had used and painted into certain scenes. Maine is sort of the second location for both James Welling and Andrew Wyeth. If Chad's Ford is home, then Maine becomes that other place that you go, and maybe it's a little strange and it doesn't quite feel like home. And so some of the photographs reflect that sense of a little less comfortable and a little more strange. One of the things we notice, and this is a great example of, is Welling's use of color is often considered, and even some printers printing his photographs have questioned whether he really meant it to be that intense. Because, you know, it has almost an artificial feeling. If you've worked on your own photos and enhanced them at home, you know sometimes you can go too far and the skin tones get very red or the sky gets overly blue. And in a scene like this, it's very kind of subtle color up above, but we've got this intense green hill. And that's a product of the digital altering that James Welling does. And it's not an accident, and it's not unwanted. As a matter of fact, he welcomes these strange color combinations. Sometimes there are odd digital effects, like a little bit of pixelation or a little bit of spotting in the ink, and he actually embraces what we call sort of happy accidents that happen along the way. And he makes the image to please himself and what he wants it to look like, not necessarily to recreate exactly what that scene looked like on that day. So he's adding his own artistic influence, his painterly kind of influence onto a photograph. So there's another instance in the gallery here of the scene not quite matching up, and the alteration that happens here in the ground of a photograph called the Olson House. The Olson House is very iconic in Andrew Wyeth's work. It's the location of Christina's World and several other images that just made Andrew Wyeth's reputation in the 1940s. Now, one of the problems with being an artist who works on the West Coast is that Maine is very far away, and you only get certain opportunities to go there and photograph it. During the process of over the years making these photographs, Welling had been waiting for a moment to capture snow in certain places, especially Chad's Ford. We would get phone calls asking what the weather forecast was and if it would be a good time to come and catch snow. Well, it's not that hard to catch snow in Maine, but it is if you're in California and you've broken your foot and can't fly. And that's the case that happened with the Olson House in snow. He had to cancel a trip to Maine and instead spent the time recovering from his broken foot by learning and fiddling with the images he already had to try and make them look right for an in the snow picture. So this snow is all borrowed from a totally different location in a totally different state, and it's been laid in. As a matter of fact, he's also trimmed the trees that would normally, if you visited the Olson House in Maine, you would see a line of pine trees behind here. He's cleared that away, and he's really silhouetted the building just as you would have seen it silhouetted in Christina's World, up really high on the hillside. But he turns it into almost a black and white image with this heavy snow that he lays in the foreground. Whereas the Olson House in snow represents a very digitized version of what the Olson House looks like today, there's another experiment here in the exhibition in which Christina's World, the very famous painting at the Museum of Modern Art, is taken as the jumping off point. And Welling went down the field from the Olson House and positioned himself right about where Christina Olson is lying in the grass in that famous painting. And he looked up the hill, and just like so many times before, he realized that the house wasn't where the house is in the painting, and the barn isn't where the barn is in the painting, and the trees aren't where the trees are in the painting. And he decided to move some of the things around, but also to keep some of the things in their natural position. So for instance, the barn is much closer to the house than it is in Christina's World. Some of these trees were in the way, and from that spot were completely blocking the house. So digitally, Welling moved them over and stuck them right here. Some of the trees that got cut out of the Olsen house and snow are back now in their natural position. And you see, I think, an appreciation you get for that forced perspective that Andrew Wyeth gives you in his painting, and Jim Welling coming through and sort of pointing out for you the dramatic effects that Wyeth laid into his painting just by pointing out to us, the viewers of the Jim Welling photograph, how very different that scene is.
So Wyeth was there in 1947, 48, and then Welling came on the scene in...
Well, this particular image is 2010, so this was one of the early works in the Wyeth series, as James Welling calls them. 2010, just about a year after Andrew Wyeth's death. I think partially the realization that this artist that was so influential to him had now passed away. And the desire to go and maybe make concrete some of his memories and thoughts about Andrew Wyeth before too much time passed was part of the genesis of this project. And so one of the key places you would go first if you were doing an Andrew Wyeth project like this is certainly to see the location of Christina's world. Jim Welling's interaction with many of the Wyeth original paintings from the time he's a teenager is largely through books and printed material. Now, he did have the opportunity to go to many museums to see them even as a teenager and as an art student, but books about Andrew Wyeth really played a large role in shaping the way Andrew Wyeth taught, in a way, James Welling through these pictures over the years collected in books. The Olsen house, just like the Kerner's house here in Chadds Ford, became a place of study and a real inspiration to Andrew Wyeth as he worked. Many of his paintings, not just the famous Christina's World, were made there. In fact, at the door to the Olsen house, which you see here, this is Door Olsen House by James Welling, is a place where Christina Olsen often sat, and Andrew Wyeth painted her on that doorstep, on the gateway to the outside world. And so the door of the Olsen house had a lot of meaning for James Welling as well, and as he photographed it, it almost comes across looking like a gelatin silver print, but these are, remember, digital images made with the digital camera, processed on the computer, and an inkjet print was made, but I think you see the fine reproduction quality that approximates gelatin silver prints, that traditional method of making photographs. And it seems subtle, but here in this photograph, there's one element of manipulation, of alteration by Welling. And that's the addition of this diagonal shadow here. And it's a very simple thing, turning everything here just a little bit darker or adding sunlight here, because it really gives you the sense that the door is open and it's leading you into the Olsen house. That here's the outside sunshine, but you've just opened the door into the space and it's darker in the interior. And so even though we don't have Christina Olsen sitting here or really any other thing to indicate that it's the Olsen house, it's a very inviting picture. And it's one of the reasons we've used it in a number of the promotional images is an invitation to look at Wyeth's world through Welling's lens. Okay, well, kind of as a fitting closure to the exhibition, we have a photograph called The Carry, which was made in 2013. The Carry is also the name of an Andrew Wyeth painting, and when the exhibition was held in Philadelphia a few years back called Memory and Magic, the very last painting in that exhibition was called The Carry. It was sort of a summing up, in Andrew Wyeth's words, at the time of his life, almost as if it was a passage and a journey on a river. And you get to certain areas of a river, if you're boating, kayaking, canoeing down them, and you just can't pass. It's that difficult, it's that rocky. And it's at those points that you have to get out and carry the boat with you, and that's where the title and the name comes from. It's the area of the river known as the Carry. Now, this is an actual river that Wyeth painted called the Goose River in Waldoboro, Maine. And this, like so many of the sites, was one of those landmarks that James Welling really wanted to find. It was like, I've compared him sort of to an archaeologist out there looking for the original sites. Welling's tools, however, were satellite imagery and Google Earth, and he knew that it was along the Goose River, and he wanted to find this exact spot to go to Maine, carry his equipment out there, and get the photograph. So he used Google Earth to look all along the river to figure out exactly where this passage where the river drops a level was, and was very excited. He made a special trip to go and find it. I remember talking to him, and he said he thought he had pinpointed the location on the satellite imagery, and he went out there and he was very excited that it matched up exactly what he thought he would find. And so the image actually conforms a lot to the original Andrew Wyeth, and that's why I say it's a very fitting finale to this exhibition, because in many ways, even though it wasn't Andrew Wyeth's last painting, it was very much a summary of his career at that moment, and seeing just how the passage of time, like the passage of the river, had taken him through the course of his career.